The Agency Principles Podcast with Doug Baxter and Simon Morgan.
What a buyer really needs to see is that I'm confident that the agency is in a place that we can help them accelerate from and into a mutually beneficial future.
That a lot of indie agency owners just aren't aware of the options that are open to them. I'm Simon Morgan.
And I'm Doug Baxter.
Doug, let's start with the obvious question today. Why this podcast? The world isn't short of agency content, let's be honest. What made us think that founders need another one?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's no shortage of people out there that are talking to issues in agencies. And I would say that a lot of that content that's out there is about the day-to-day operational stuff of agencies, right? How to run your agency better, how to do things around new business, how to do things about process, what kind of services that you're building. This is all very important stuff and it's very good. But really, we're talking about something that's completely different that we've identified as a real need for information out there from agency owners. And it's much more of an existential question. It's the real question that comes up when you've been running an agency business for about 10 years. And it really goes beyond that every day-to-day operational stuff. And it's much more about what am I really looking to build here? Where is this enterprise going? What is the value of this enterprise? And what do I need to do to maximize my options when it comes time to sell that business? And I can tell you from my first experience, when I first sold an agency, I really didn't know anything about any of that stuff because I was completely and utterly focused on my clients, being in their receptions, upselling them on the new services we were developing, building the best team that I could, the best creative people, the best strategic people, in order that we had the best product. So when it came time to sell, I knew none of this stuff. And as a result, I think the first agency I sold, we didn't really do the deal that we could or should have. And that really goes to our central mission here, which is to ensure that all independent agency owners get the most value for their life's work.
Yeah. I think there's something else probably worth saying about why now specifically, because I think that the agency market is genuinely in a period of transition. And the assumptions that many of the founders that we speak to have carried for years really about who buys agencies, what they pay, and why. A lot of those assumptions need updating. And I think for us, that's the key component really of why the podcast. And so as the season unfolds, we've got buyers of every kind coming in, holdcos, private equity, strategic acquirers, and they'll tell you themselves how the market has shifted. I think the short version is that agencies that are well positioned right now are the ones that are really deliberately focusing on their strategy and they're not reactive.
That's exactly it, Simon, because I think in the times they're in, all agency owners have got to understand that we're looking at it through a whole new prism of the ground underneath agencies has shifted over the last 2 or 3 years. And so you've really got to understand that this prism is built of different components, which is we're in the great age of uncertainty together and build better agencies, more future-facing agency models. And then, of course, seeing the whole ever-changing shift that's been caused by technology and AI. And so it's very important to understand how agencies can build vision and value when it comes to that dynamic as well.
Yep. And I think also, Doug, we've seen this tremendous rise over the last few years of the indie agency. The pendulum has swung massively away from holdcos and to the rise of strong indie agencies. And in the work that we do, I mean, we know that there's something like 100,000 indie agencies around the world and so much change happening there, but also so many different types of agency, the shift away from the sort of full service generalist agency into much more specific, targeted propositions. But I think with that also comes that issue really for founders is that very often they become the face of the agency. They make all of the decisions. They really become the identity of the agency. And I think the other point I'd add to that is I think that independence, what we're seeing over time, it just becomes the default sort of option. All that is you just don't know what you don't know. And I think that a lot of indie agency owners just aren't aware of the options that are open to them from a growth perspective. So that's, again, an area I think that we really need to explore.
I agree with you. And it's interesting talking to the buyers and again, looking at their perspective, because, I hear pretty dramatic things, right, from buyers when we talk to them every day, like such as, one buyer said to me a few weeks ago, "Oh, we wouldn't go near a generalist agency. We have no desire to catch a falling knife." The
Yeah.
idea that if you're a generalist agency who does many different things and serves many different sectors, well, it's just not a sustainable model anymore. That the model of the future is agencies that have developed specific technology, specific domain expertise, specific processes, which may be optimized by technology and AI. And they're very good at that thing that they do that can't be copied or repeated because they've built such highly specific solutions and technology and intellectual property around it. And that's really where the real value is going forward. That's how you can
Yeah.
protect your agency.
I think you just alluded to the sort of the changing landscape from a buyer perspective, and I think that universe has shifted considerably. For years, I think the assumption was if you build something good, a holdco will come along. Eventually, WPP, this Omnicom, they'll make you an offer. You'll do a deal. Life goes on, and we still see a little bit of that. But the holdco model's been under such pressure, structural pressure, of late that, and of course, then we often hear those nightmarish stories of the holdco earnout dragging on and the rug getting pulled in terms of how earnouts are calculated and so on. And so that landscape is evolving, and I think there's a couple of players who have begun to fill that void, if you like. Private equity, and lots of discussion from agency owners about private equity, and we'll be focusing on that in future episodes because PE just thinks about agencies very differently from holdcos. They're building platforms through a strategic thesis. They're looking for outstanding agency operators at the helm. Sure, that's the same, but it's businesses that can anchor a new platform proposition that they can bolt onto with a hold horizon of 4, 5, 6 years. And that's very disconcerting, I think, for a lot of agency owners. I think there's a lot of myths out there that we need to bust on that landscape, because there are some good PE stories out there. They're not all bad. And then I think you've got the strategic acquirers, generally agencies buying other agencies, which might be to add capability they don't have or access to geography that they want to get into. And we'll be talking to Damien Ely at the Many, which is a great example. He's on later in the season. He's acquisitions purely to build positioning rather than just scale. So I guess the short answer is the market's more complex, but it's really in a lot of ways more interesting than it's ever been. But again, you just need better information to be able to navigate that landscape.
I just make one point. I mean, if you're an agency owner and if you're out there waiting for a holdco to come calling, I think forget about it, because number one, they're not really calling anymore. We've seen Dentsu go to market trying to sell an agency that grew up out of a huge patchwork of adding agencies and scale of all different kinds. And because there was no central strategic hypothesis or direction behind it, they couldn't even sell that business, a very profitable business. They had to withdraw it from the market. And secondly, our holdco is a nice place to work. We've both had our experience of being in there. I'm not going to speak for you, Simon, but I can say worst working experience of my life. And so honestly, I never want any of our clients to have that experience either. So there's only one holdco, us, who we generally recommend because they're a people first organization. Apart from that, we don't really recommend it because the jury's out on whether they actually have a future at all. WPP struggling, real energy behind the Omnicom IPG. We've yet to see on that. Publicis may be doing a little better, but who knows what the future holds. So it's important for owners to understand exactly as you said, what are the options with PE or PBE backed agency networks? Who are the strategic buyers out there? Who are the emerging buyers? Who are the new buyers out there that they should be aware of that they may even not be thinking of?
That's right. And there are a new breed of networks, either indie or listed, new what we call challenger networks that are really coming to the fore. So yeah, lots of change there. So really the purpose of today, we wanted to talk about some of the things that buyers look for in agencies today, in today's landscape. We can't ignore the thing that's reshaping how everyone in the industry thinks about value. What's your honest read on AI, Doug? What's it actually doing to agencies right now?
Well, it's still dominating conversations around transactions and acquisitions at the moment to a very large extent because it's the question that first comes up when buyers are examining an agency. They tend to be very focused on what is this agency's response to AI. We were on a call between a buyer and an agency a few weeks ago, and they asked that question to the agency owner, and the agency owner replied, well, we're just really looking at that at the moment. And I knew in that very second that the conversation was over. It's too late. What's very important is you have that vision of how it's going to drive your future. And you're not focused on a race to the bottom, on the commoditization of creativity, content, and production that really is not a part of the future. Yes, it's going to exist, but that's not where you're going to make your profit. What you're really focused in is how you can swim upstream in strategy, in unique creative vision and capabilities, in how AI can drive the scaling of the business rather than the commoditization, how it is enabling you to create something unique and unreplicable that you do, which I've already alluded to, how you build technology around that domain expertise, how you create intelligence and incorporate data into what you do.
Yeah. That's exactly right. I think what we're seeing is an expectation that agencies are optimizing process using AI and hopefully able to capture a few more margin points there in terms of the day-to-day operations through just getting more efficient. But as you say, that in itself is just a race to the bottom. What you have to focus on is the strategic positioning, deep sector expertise, proprietary methodology, data assets, and creative thinking that moves businesses forward. And that's unique, not easy to replicate. And so the people factor, I think, it's always been a people business. I don't think that's changing.
There's one thing I guess I left out, which is important. How do you stitch all of that together in a way that drives better efficiency and better profitability?
That's right.
And that's that's what they're focused on.
So that's a good segue, Doug, I think, into what we see as the 5 key drivers of value. What are buyers actually examining when they assess an agency? And let's pick off the first of those, just leading off your point, which is financial health. And this is something that we see all the time. Owners, I think they understand it, and in many cases they do. The most common mistake that we see is founders confusing revenue with value. We're a $14 million agency, and the buyer sort of nods and politely and immediately starts asking about something else entirely, because they're not buying revenue generally, they're buying profitability. And there's an old adage that we use in our business, Doug. What's the saying?
We love it. Well, I use it. I've taken it from you and I use it in every meeting now that we talk to it, is that profit will set you free.
And that's exactly right. The operating profit of the business is critical, and there are some benchmarks that founders need to be aware of. Just called below 15% EBITDA as a proportion of gross profit. That's the important number, is the percentage of profits to your gross margin or your gross profit. So if you're under 15%, you've got work to do. 15 to 20%, that's table stakes, and over 20% is good. Over 25% is very good. We don't see it very often, but it's absolutely possible to get your agency to that point, back to the position of doing less commoditized work and more high value work. And then also the other financial metric that gets studied a lot is how much you're spending on staff, your staff cost ratio. What's your thoughts on that, Doug?
That really are interested in acquiring agencies that have 65% and below of staff cost ratio. And then if you add overheads and no more than 20%, that's leaving you that 15% average or that 15% threshold that does it. Now, the issue is that we see a lot of businesses out there that, are high as 82, 85% in staff cost ratio. We see that a lot, particularly in things like PR in particular, which are very, very high in staff costs in relation to gross profit. So that is a metric. We have this kind of series of golden metrics that exist out there in the business that acquirers tend to look at as an indicator of how healthy and how future facing an agency business is.
What's the second driver, Doug? We were talking about founder dependency.
Really, when acquirers look at it, and for many of the businesses that we're selling, a lot of those businesses are agency owners have decided that there isn't a horizon to their business, that really they've got 3-5 years that they want to be in the business. Has that owner developed a secondary leadership team who are capable of not just the day-to-day, but strategically running that business when the owner is gone, developing new business, developing new vision, because a lot of acquirers don't want to acquire agencies that they then have to run, because that's going to take their attention away from growth. So they want to be confident that they're acquiring a business in which the secondary leadership team, certainly within 2 or 3 years, are completely capable of running that business without the original founder. And a lot of the factors like the client relationships aren't dependent on the founders. The financial decision-making isn't dependent on the founders. The operating efficiency and capabilities aren't dependent on founder decision-making. And that can be quite hard, because from going into agencies as much as we do every day, looking under the bonnet of agencies, in a huge amount of independent agencies, the founding CEO tends to be the bottleneck. We see it time and time again where all roads lead to that person, because they tend to be a very driven, very young person who has really used their own energy to build the agency and finds it hard to delegate to other people, because they've had so many times where they've had to reach deep within themselves to propel the agency along. And so it's absolutely vital when you're going through this process of exit planning and planning in the future of the agency, building that broad team, devolving the leadership and making sure that there is a core of leadership at the next level, which can take on the running of the agency.
I would say also from a PE lens perspective, very often they're looking for a powerful operator to drive forward their platform business. And so in many cases, they're actually looking for a founder that's prepared to stay on, to roll the dice forward, roll forward equity, and potentially be there 5, 6, 7 years. So that's another big consideration. So I guess the message there is start planning that and start thinking about that early. And it's the time to start is always earlier than you think it is.
That's a great point, because with time and you'll know this from talking to people, Sarah, but with a lot of founders, they've always got this vision in their head, like the time is going to be right to sell my agency in 2 years when I finally won those 3, 4 big clients that they want to that I want to have, and we've moved our profitability up a level where I can get more. And they see it very much from their own perspective. But the reality is the right time to sell your agency is when it's the right time for buyers. Again, you've got to look at it from their perspective. And when the good buyers are out there buying in your sector, you should be out there engaging with them and talking to them so that you find the person who needs that specific thing that it is which your agency is great at a time which is right for them. And that's the best way to do a transaction that is going to deliver the most value for you, the agency owner. Yeah, let's talk about the third one, Simon. Maybe we'll
Let's
switch.
talk client portfolio. Yeah. Let's talk about that, because I think clients is a very key one, and most agency owners will have heard the phrase client concentration before. And so often we work with agencies who have a single client that the agency was built on, maybe two, who together represent 50, 60, 70% of the business. And they can get sometimes a little bit surprised when we raise that as an issue, because in some of these client engagements, you might be working with 10 different clients within a single brand. I mean, worked with agencies who work with Microsoft or Meta, lots of different client types where you have very complex intertwined relationships. You have the institutional memory of all of the marketing campaigns that have happened over the last 15 years. And still yet, that is not enough in many cases to de-risk that from a buyer point of view. Because, of course, they're always coming at this through the lens of, what's the risk here? What's the risk if the founder leaves tomorrow? What's the risk if the biggest client, that's 50% of the agency, leaves tomorrow? And those factors definitely are discounting factors. They don't necessarily mean the end of a transaction, but they do discount valuation. Linked to that is the nature of remuneration from some of these higher concentration clients. Because obviously retainers and retained revenue is very important, and that's worth more than project-based. And again, we have that conversation with owners as to why that is the case. And that's, again, another lens that buyers look through. It's not saying that project-based shops can't do transactions. Of course they can, but they need to be exceptional in other areas to compensate for that. Let's move on to driver forward. This one, Doug, is positioning. And I think this has shifted a lot over the last few years. And we've touched on this in the earlier part of this conversation. So agencies that specialize tend to be worth more than those that don't. That's just a simple
Exactly
fact.
right. Because as I talked about with that falling knife metaphor that was made by a buyer in the last couple of weeks, they no longer are that interested. They don't see the value in the jack of all trades, master of none agency model, unless it has a real defined position that buyers can understand, and they can understand the technology that these guys have built. It's going to diminish the valuation that they put against that agency. So it's much better to combine 2 or 3 things that will optimize the value of the agency. The first thing is that specialist intellectual property, that specialist domain expertise, which is you've taken your knowledge of a specific market and you've turned that into technology, into methodologies, into thinking, into services that literally nobody else can replicate. They're built on deep market knowledge. They're built on the legacy and the institutional knowledge of your agency. They're built on the work you've done around your clients and the information that they've given you access to. So that's incredibly important, incredibly valuable, because when a buyer looks at that, they may be a much, much larger agency and they think, wow, imagine if we had that. They've done this for this small auto company in, the Midwest, but actually we see how we could replicate that for one of the big manufacturers and sell them solutions that are worth tens of millions of pounds or dollars or euro. So it's an incredibly important factor. The other thing is maybe to, rather than, and this is a tough one to do, but rather than focus your new business in a scattergun approach, focus on 2 or 3 sectors. This is something that buyers can also much more clearly understand. Where they have an agency where, for instance, we're working with an agency at the moment, which is in entertainment and sport. Those 2 areas are actually super hot right now as far as buyers are concerned. 2 sectors where they have one business from a lot of the studios, a lot of the streamers, a lot of the entertainment brands and the sport, a lot of the sports bodies, a lot of the sponsors and people that are involved in sports. So when a buyer is moving into that marketplace, they go, wow, fantastic. Look what we have here. We really don't have, we'd love to get into that market, but we don't have that many connections or affiliations or a client base. But look at this agency. If we acquire these guys, then that gives us automatic access to all the players, which we can potentially cross-sell solutions to that these guys don't do. It gives us real credibility when we go to new clients to say, hey, we're doing all of these people. So of course we know what we're talking about. They can bring people in the room that can talk very well about their experience built up over many years about working in this sector. So having a very strong positioning around your area of expertise, your clients, what you do it and how you do it is incredibly important in maximizing the value of your agency.
Yeah, makes sense. And, my practical guidance here is don't try and invent a new category of agencies, because buyers are always going to try and bucket you into digital media, performance, social data, influencer analytics, CX, whatever. And they kind of know what they're looking for. But I think the opportunity is, in addition to developing IP, is to pick a category or 2 and become a specialist in that area. And it's exactly what you were talking about there, to be the definitive healthcare customer experience agency or the leading influencer shop for luxury brands. Okay, let's move on to the last of our 5 drivers for today. This one is a bit of a catch-all, but it's called forward momentum. And I think where we're coming from with this is, for a lot of founders, they think that the transaction is the finish line. Oh, we've made it. We've done the transaction. But from a buyer's point of view, that's actually the start line of the race, not the finish line. The deal is not the destination. So, these guys are acquiring future revenue and future growth. And what they need to see is evidence that this business is future-proof for us. And that's not a vague ambition or hopium. There's a plan, there's a pipeline with process behind it and new business activity behind it, with hires and investments mapped out. And I think that you can reach that point where you're running out of energy, but actually you need to keep something in the tank for that new start that is the end of the transaction. So you've got to create a sense that something real and tangible is coming and is on the horizon, and that buyers are acquiring not at the top of the curve, but on the accelerating rise up the curve.
They're not buying the past. The numbers from, if you look at it for this year, the numbers on 22 to 25 are really only validating the premise on which they're buying. What is important to the buyer is the values from 26 to 28, 29. because that's intrinsically, what they are buying, and acquisition is a risk mitigation exercise. So they're weighing up that risk mitigation and saying, okay, well, how sure are we that we're going to buy something which, as you say, is going up, rather than a lot of agencies have had turbulent last couple of years. And that's fine. It's fine. Virtually every agency we've seen has had some point in recent past where they've had to recalibrate, they've had a stumble coming out of the pandemic, all of these issues. But what a buyer really needs to see is that confident that the agency is in a place that we can help them accelerate from and into a mutually beneficial future.
So, Doug, we're going to go deeper on all of these themes through this season of the podcast. We'll be talking to founders and buyers who've been in these conversations themselves. The Match Fit framework is on the Agency Futures website, which I'll put a link in the show notes. Let's talk about the next episode, because we're going to sit down with Stephen Brown, the founder of Fuse Create in Toronto. And Stephen's story is brilliant. He's one who's actually been close to selling twice, 2 separate occasions, 2 serious conversations with buyers, and he walked away from both of them, which of course immediately makes you want to ask, well, why? The answer's not what you'd expect. So that's next time. Thanks for listening to the Principles Podcast. We'll catch up soon. The Agency Principles Podcast was brought to you by Doug Baxter and Simon Morgan from Agency Futures. If you like what you've heard today, please follow or subscribe to get the latest updates.